welcome. My name is Misha Ketchell. I'm the managing editor of The Conversation. Today, we're asking a fairly simple question, which is whether the Western view of corruption in Indonesia accords with reality. To help us answer this question, we're joined by two very accomplished writers with a deep knowledge of Indonesia. Ahmad Fuadi was born in West Sumatra in 1972. A Fulbright scholar, he was inspired by his time at an Islamic boarding school to create his celebrated novel, Negeri Five Menara, which has sold more than 100,000 copies in its first year. It's been translated into English as The Land of the Five Towers, and the novel's been adapted into a successful feature film. Fuadi is also the founder of Komunitas Menara, a not-for-profit organisation helping poor children to obtain free access to education. Our other guest today is Elizabeth Pisani, who is a London-based journalist and epidemiologist, best known for her work on HIV/AIDS. Her latest book is Indonesia, etc. Today we're going to start with some observations from Elizabeth, followed by a moderated conversation between Elizabeth and Fuadi. But before we begin, I'd like to read you some observations about Elizabeth from the writer and broadcaster Simon Winchester's review of Indonesia, etc. in the Wall Street Journal earlier this year. He said, "Ms. Pisani is a force of nature. She is a British-educated American, a young 50, vastly intelligent, doggedly curious, spectacularly multilingual, and, as we learned from Indonesia, etc., lately divorced from her Javanese husband. We also learn that she is a seasoned and gossipy drinker, which is especially promising, an occasional smoker, a determined atheist, and as adventurous a traveller as it is possible to imagine, though one quite able to break down in tears of desperation to admit it and to write about it. In her youth, Miss Pisani pursued a career as a journalist and a foreign correspondent, fascinated mostly by countries lying to the east of India. But in midlife, she underwent a sea change. She began an academic study of public health care and in consequence developed a sympathetic interest in the lives and fates of prostitutes. She now has an almost fanatical attachment to the practice of safe sex and has written a well-received, though not uncontroversial, book that preaches its benefits, to which she or her publishers gave the unashamedly commercial title, The Wisdom of Whores. Now Ms. Pisani has turned her talents and passions to a close examination of the country she knows best and that attracts her most keenly. She recently spent a full year wandering alone through the least familiar corners of a country that is far less well known than its size and immense population of 251 million would suggest it should be. And with Indonesia, etc., she has produced a treasure of a volume. With that, I'll welcome Elizabeth Pisani.
Thank you very much. I can't begin to tell you how many errors of fact there are in that. I want to start with the fact that when it was published just a couple of months ago, I was not yet 50. I am now, and I celebrated that hideous fact by learning trapeze flying, which I thoroughly recommend as a birthday activity. It was really good fun. I am very grateful to all of you for coming, particularly because this was the response from an Australian editor to the idea of acquiring a book about Indonesia for this market. Australians are not interested in Indonesia, perhaps because it's our closest neighbour. Now, I found that quite interesting because actually, it's a trait that the rest of the world shares also. It's one of the most fascinating and diverse countries on the planet, and one of the least known. And there are so many different things that we could talk about, but I think that with Fuadi here, who obviously knows the country spectacularly better than I do, it's interesting to have a look at foreign perspectives and local perspectives and all of these things. And an issue that always comes up in Indonesia is corruption. Now, Indonesians are crap at sport. So 250 million, except for badminton, which they're very good at. 250 million people is the total population, and the total population that went to the London Olympics in 2012, Indonesian athletes, was 22. and a number of those got barred for cheating. But when you have this conversation in tea stalls or boats or whatever around Indonesia, everyone's like, aduh, I so wish there were a World Cup in corruption, then we'd win. It's kind of a local joke. And I want to start with telling you a story. So I lived for many years in Jakarta, where I've always ridden a motorbike. And just to facilitate one's way around the city, I keep money clipped to the back of my driving license. So if one is stopped by the police for doing something wrong, like going the wrong way up a one-way street, which is going to save one a 45-minute journey around the choked and traffic-clogged streets of Jakarta, then I just hand them my driving license, and they'd take the money off the back, and we'd have a little chat, and then you'd go on. Now, I would never do that if they stopped me for not doing anything wrong. If I wasn't doing anything wrong, and that actually quite rarely happens. Mostly you're stopped because you're doing something wrong. And then I just see it as a bit of a transaction fee. I'm not paying very much in taxes. In fact, very few Indonesians pay very much in taxes. The cops are desperately underpaid. They're having to pay bribes to their kids, to their kids' teachers to keep them in school and etc. So instead of me paying it to the government, which is going to cream a whole lot off the top, at that time it was the Suharto years when I first started doing this, and it was going to end up in Swiss bank account, better that I just give it directly to the cops, was my reasoning, because it's a fee for doing something wrong. Now, since the end of the Suharto years, there's been this really dramatic decentralization in Indonesia that we'll talk a bit about because it really affects the structure of corruption. It means that an awful lot of power has been devolved to very, very small places very far from the center. So I usually have my paper map up here and spring around pointing at it, and I don't know if I know how to use this, but I was in the Kai Islands, which are around here, so fairly remote, and I was in a village called Ahmad Fuadi, which is a village that doesn't have a road to it, so there's no motorized transport in the village, although you can now get to it and just walk the last couple of kilometers. And I was staying with a family who had actually met about 7 years before on a previous journey when I'd got on a boat without knowing where it was going. And the guy had come around to collect the tickets and said, "So where are you going to?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know. Where are we going?" And there was a guy sitting next to me who was like, "Come on, you're kidding." He couldn't believe I'd got on a boat having no idea where it was going. And he said, "Well, you're coming with us, obviously." So I said, "Fine." So I went and stayed with him and his family and in this place called Ahmad Fuadi. And some years later, after decentralization, I went back again. And I was staying again with this family, and we were just shooting the shit in the kitchen. And I was catching up on all the family news. And Pak Yopi said, "Oh, I'm so proud because my daughter now has a job as a teacher." And getting a civil service job is a very, very desirable thing, particularly in the outer islands where there's virtually no other salaried employment. And so she got a job as a teacher, and I said, "Oh, right, where's she teaching?" "Oh, it was awful," he said. "We heard that the list was going to be published from the local ministry, and on the list she was assigned to Waur." And he says, "And Waur, it's in the middle of nowhere." Here we are sitting in Ahmad, which is really, in the middle of nowhere. And it's an even smaller village, even further buried in actually only about 9 kilometers up the coast by boat. And he said, "Oh, it was dreadful." And so I went straight to the office. I got on the boat and I went to the office and I said to the head of the department, "You can't put my daughter in Waur. That's, we're family. You can't do that." And he said, "Oh, sorry, it's out of my hands now. Everyone knows that the list is going to be published later today." And so he said, I thought, but we've got a family member, one of our big family, our keluarga besar, who is an MP in Jakarta. So I telephoned him and I said, hey, they're trying to post your great niece, second 3 times removed, to Waur. And he said, oh, don't worry, I'll fix it. And within half an hour, they'd postponed the announcement of the postings. They redid the list, and the next day they announced it, and she was in Tual, in the district capital. And he said, isn't that great? And I said, yeah, good for you, that's great. And a bit later in the conversation, we're talking about driving a motorbike around Jakarta. He was like, oh, how do you do that? So dangerous, this and that. And I said, well, you take shortcuts. And I told him about keeping money clipped to the back of my driving license. And I said, it's funny, I guess that makes me a corruptor, corruptor, And we all laughed. And then I said, it's funny, I guess where I come from, maybe the story of your daughter, you calling the MP and your daughter getting moved to a different post would be considered corruption. In fact, in Indonesia, Indonesians are very fond of contracting long and difficult words and concepts. So the concept of corruption is actually contracted as KKN, korupsi, kolusi, dan nepotisme, all in one neat package, KKN. And I said, in Britain that might be considered KKN. Low ceiling, sticky air. And then his wife got up and said, shall we go to church? And that was the end of that conversation. And afterwards I thought, actually, I felt rather bad, not just because I was rude to my hosts, but in fact, in the structure of Indonesian society now, that's not really corruption. And understanding the difference between that and real graft, the sort of graft that pays for sex workers in Singapore and drugs in Jakarta hotel rooms, is, I think, one of the keys to understanding the way Indonesia's developing and the way all of this talk about corruption, etc., is not necessarily as negative as it's frequently painted. And to understand that, you have to understand a bit about the history of Indonesia. So Fuadi will correct me for all the mistake when I make mistakes, won't you, please? But essentially, Indonesia is an accident of the cupidity of Dutch merchants, really. So after the wars between Muslims and Christians in Europe, the trade routes that went through Saudi, up through India, Saudi, and to Constantinople or Venice, and then on into Europe, were essentially closed off. And the Europeans, who were very keen to access particularly spices, which were very, very low volume, high income commodity, thought that they would do well to find a direct route to the spices. So in 1497, Vasco da Gama made his way around the bottom of Africa and found a direct route to Asia. And then there started a great scramble between a lot of the European powers, which was eventually won by not a country, but a company, the Dutch East India Company. Now, the Dutch East India Company was the world's first joint stock corporation, and it was the cause of the very first stock exchange in the world, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which was created to trade stocks in the Dutch East India Company. And they did quite well for about 100 years, and then they got greedier and greedier, and they started becoming more and more bellicose. So they were protecting themselves against other European nations who also wanted part of the trade by building forts, by having warships, by building up this huge army, really. And so they toppled into bankruptcy right at the end of the 18th century, in 1897. Now, by that time, they employed almost 50,000 people. They had 5,000 boats. It was too big to fail. Are we seeing any resonances in the recent corporate history here? And the Dutch East Indies Company was too big to fail. And so it got taken over by the Crown of the Netherlands. So Indonesia was never a colonial project in the way that some of the other European colonies were. It was always an extractive, and a commercial enterprise. And the Dutch, after the Crown took over, were quite clever. They realized that they could never have enough bureaucrats to actually really tame and control this whole huge swathe, which if you put the top corner there, Aceh, where London is, the bottom corner, Merauke, comes out at Tehran. So, it's a massive swathe. It's over 13,500 islands. It's a huge number of different ethnic groups and different languages, different religions, etc. And so rather than try and weld that all together into a colony in the way, for example, the British did in another very, very diverse place, India, or Nigeria, they just said, okay, we're just going to essentially co-opt local rulers, and we're going to rule through them. We're going to make them our tax collectors, essentially, was what happened. So there was a great exercise of co-option. And that's had resonances to this day. But there was also a footprint which was only very, very loosely imprinted over this whole huge swathe. So in the middle is Java, which is, you can see, I don't know if there. It's only 7% of the landmass, but it's 60% of the population. And it's always been the vast concentration of the population. So there they really controlled things. But in the outer islands, it was much, much looser. Now, when the nationalist movement started to grow, I should say that part of when I say that they were not building a colony in the way that, for example, the Brits and the French did, trying to rule through culture and trying to bring in education, and even though it was a bit patronizing, educate the savages, at least the Brits were doing some educating. At the turn of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 1900s, would anyone like to take a guess how many Indonesians, natives as they were called, had, actually I'm going to ask you to guess, how many Indonesians had any secondary school education at the beginning of the 1900s?
I don't know.
25. 25 individuals, not 25,000, 25 individuals in a population that was then around 38 million. So there was really a gap in a kind of national intelligentsia that would have been constructed if everyone spoke the same language, if everyone, for example, if they all learned Dutch in school even, or if there were a national language. Now, the early nationalists decided to try and create such a national language. So there was the Youth Pledge, the Sumpah Pemuda in 1928, where a number of leaders, not just from the central island of Java, but also from some other islands, decided that they were going to try and envisage this loose coalition of now Dutch-controlled islands as a nation. And they began to fight towards that. And then the Second World War interrupted. Tell me if this is too much history, but I think it's really important to understand the way that corruption has evolved. The Second World War interrupted, the Japanese invaded, the Dutch fled. And then, when the Japanese were defeated, the Indonesians very rapidly, the leaders of that nationalist movement, declared independence. And they declared the independence of the Republic of Indonesia, the details of the transfer of power, etc., will be worked out as soon as possible. That was the entire Declaration of Independence. So there was only a really vague notion, that's why my book is called Indonesia, etc. There's only a vague notion of what this nation is going to look like. But they had the great advantage of a common enemy. So the first president, Suharto, who declared himself president in 1945, then had the very mixed blessing of the Dutch trying to come back in. So after the end of the war, the Dutch decided that they were going to repossess their old colony. That's almost impossible to imagine now. But they thought they were just going to walk happily straight back in. So Indonesia had to fight after its declaration of independence, fought a war for 4 years to actually consolidate that independence. It was 4.5 years before it was actually recognized by the Dutch, and they ceded sovereignty. So Sukarno basically kept the country together with this vision of a state free of colonialism, a vision of a national state that is going to fill the whole footprint of our glorious, slightly mythical past. And then what happens? Well, the economy, actually, independence isn't all it's cracked up to be, and the economy disintegrates even further. There are rebellions in at least 6 locations around the islands, and so he creates fictional enemies. We've got rid of the Dutch, so we can't use them anymore. So he creates a fictional enemy of the United Nations in an effort to get Papua, Indonesian Papua, back into the fold. Then he creates a fictional enemy of Malaysia. But it was so chaotic that in 1965, there was a very complicated transfer of power that may or may not have been related to a coup attempt, etc. To cut a very long, very bloody story very short, a military man of no great distinction by the name of Suharto took over government. Now, here's where the corruption story gets really interesting, because Suharto realized that rhetoric was not going to hold this disparate nation together. He had to hold it together with something more than just glorious appeals to rhetoric. So what he did was he created 2 armies. One of them was the military, and one of them was an army of bureaucrats, both uniformed, sometimes indistinguishable. And he created a pyramid of corruption that really had 3, it was sort of triangular. A lot of the contracts went to the army. All of the development contracts went either to the army, essentially, or to a very, very small number of conglomerates, mostly owned by ethnic Chinese. And the deal was that you get the contracts, you get the monopolies, you cream off the rents, but you deliver what you're supposed to deliver. And the army was supposed to deliver stability, and the conglomerates were supposed to deliver jobs and economic growth and development. And they both did that pretty effectively for quite a long time. But having done that, they could put as much money in Singaporean bank accounts as they wanted to. And they did, a lot. Now, as Suharto's kids grew up, they began to get greedier and greedier. And Suharto started giving the pieces of the pie that used to go to the military and used to go to the Chinese conglomerates, more and more he gave them to his kids. And of his kids, he didn't demand anything. There was no quid pro quo. So that became totally extractive. That was extractive corruption. It was taking money out of the Indonesian economy and not putting anything back into it. Since the end of the Suharto years, there's been this radical decentralization that I talked about. And part of the reason that the decentralization has been so radical, I think, and I think Fuadi may have different views on this, was because of the loss of East Timor, which you probably know quite a lot about, and I don't need to give you very much background. But East Timor, as a province that was essentially invaded by Indonesia in 1975 and incorporated after that, was given the chance to have a referendum. And I think that the elites in Jakarta really believed that the rhetoric, I was a journalist in Indonesia at the time, and always being taken, or much earlier actually, in the mid-Suharto years, and I was always being hauled in and slapped upside the head for not telling them about the roads, because I was talking about the political instabilities and the discontent and the fury of the people of Timor being always under the Indonesian military jackboot. And the military spokesman, a guy called Pak Nur Hadi, used to say, yeah, but you know, okay, some of that, yeah, we recognize some of that's true, but did you tell them about the roads? We built roads, we built clinics, we built schools. And they did, it is true. And I think that the elite in Jakarta really believed that the Timorese were going to be so grateful for those great presence of development that they were going to vote to stay with Indonesia. Now, that didn't happen. They voted with a very large majority to leave Indonesia. Now, it's my belief that that created a bit of a trauma in the Indonesian elite. And the then president, who was very much of the Suharto era, said, okay, we need to decentralize because we need to release some of the pressures that are building up against this Javanese hegemony. But if we do it to the level of the provinces, there are lots of other provinces. Papua, incredibly rich in natural resources. Aceh, very rich in natural resources, both already with a history of rebellion. Riau, starting to get, with a huge natural gas field, starting to get stroppy. East Kalimantan, biggest deposits of coal in the world, starting to get stroppy. So he said, okay, we need to decentralize, but we're going to do it to the level of the district. So instead of at the time of independence, at the time of the end of the Suharto era, 27 provinces, and after the loss of Timor, 26, there are now 35. Instead of decentralizing to the level of the province, because provinces might want to spin off, we're going to decentralize to the level of the district. And at that time, there were 298 districts, and now there are 500 or so. No one's exactly sure. Now, what does that mean? It means that people like Pat Yopi, sitting in Ohawait, for the first time ever, actually has some influence, because someone in his big family, his keluarga besar, is close enough to local government to be able to make and to influence decisions. In the centralized, in the Suharto era, that was never the case. So in a way, it's given Indonesians more power than they've ever had before. Indonesia has become one of the most democratic countries in the world. And in fact, it's a great deal more democratic, arguably, than Australia, because people vote directly for the leaders of the country instead of, voting for representatives who then are in swing seats. And so, whatever plays well in the western suburbs, all of that bollocks. That's not the case. People vote directly for their leaders at the national level, but also at the local level. So that's created an opportunity for patronage that is really quite extraordinary, because these people who are vying for these 500 kingships, sultanates basically, around the country, have an awful lot to gain from becoming a district leader, because they now have so much authority and so much power over budgets, most of which come from the center. And that's a really crucial point. So Indonesia's total tax take last year was $105 billion, and about half of that went directly back in untied funds to the districts and the provinces, which is an awful lot for districts and provinces to be able to distribute essentially as they see fit. And as they see fit is ways that are going to keep themselves in power. And that means distributing contracts to people who've supported you, and it means distributing jobs to people who've supported you. And it creates what people complain about endlessly as money politics and corruption. And when you say to people, okay, you complain and complain and complain about this, but you are one of the most democratic countries in the world now. You could, if you really hate the system so much, why don't you change it? People say, yeah, but actually, now my cousin's a local MP, and everyone's got, no one's more than 2 degrees of separation now away from some level of power that is able to actually distribute favors in some way. So that extractive corruption of things ending up in Singapore bank accounts has actually turned into a very different model, which is, you could almost call it trickle-down corruption or distributive corruption. Because yes, money is getting funneled up and the guys are creaming 10% off every contract and the guys are giving contracts, but it's staying in circulation in the economy in parts of the country that have never really had much of an economy before. So I would argue, possibly controversially, that this new model of corruption is actually more democratic and delivering more to more people than the previous levels of corruption. And I think it's therefore going to become even harder to uproot. And I think I might stop there because I can see you dying to disagree.
Yeah.
Silakan.
And I think, thank you very much. I guess the first question for you, Fadi, is it true to say that the new corruption is more democratic than the old?
Well, first of all, I'm envious of you to get to know my country very intimately, much better than I do. And you know data about corruption and everything, and I think I'm not that authoritative to have the data about the corruption, but I think I can share my side of the story about what I feel when I live inside the system under two era, Suharto era and after Suharto era. So I don't answer directly to your question, but I have a story to tell actually. 2 years ago, I started with my readers of my book. We start a foundation, a social foundation to build a school for poor people. So it's free. And after a few weeks, we found out that we just cannot bring together kids and teach them. We have to have a permit. And then we start to have problem, because to get a permit, you have to talk to your community leaders. And you get a signature, then you go up further to a bigger community leaders. Then you get another signature, then you go up to another office. What do you call kelurahan?
Ward, city ward.
City ward. And when we met with the official there, he told us, hey, the permit cannot be issued. There is a price for that. And we argued, hey, we actually try to help you. This is a social cause. It's free for the children, for the poor people. And the official told us, if you have a foundation, normally the foundation will be used to extract money, to collect money. That's the normal business. So I doubt this is social for social cause. So no money, no permit. And it's not about the number. The number is so small, maybe around less than $100. But for me, personally, I don't want to play that game. So I said, no, please come to our school, see yourself. It is true, we try to help people. He didn't do that, and he told us, well, no money, no permit. So at that point, I declare a war. A war, not a physical war, a digital war. So I went back and I start updating my status on Facebook. And then I send my tweet telling people, well, as a quite successful writer in Indonesia, I have 100,000 followers on my Twitter and Facebook. I tell them, hey, we try to build this school and we have problem with the permit. If anybody there know the people inside the government, please help us. So what happened? Next day, early in the morning, that official came to our school angrily and gave us the permit for free. But he got angry. What happened? You know, last night in the middle of wedding, my boss called me up and asked me to deliver you the permit. What happened? You know, this is a very small example of what happened in Indonesia. This is not uncommon. But for me, what is quite special, that through social media, actually you have hope. You are nobody, but you can say your voice, you can air your voice through social media, and someone out there can help you. What if we can build a platform that we can collect evidence, we can collect everything from different parts of Indonesia and put it together? It can be a force, a very powerful force to fight corruption. So maybe I'm a naive, but I'm optimist here. I'm a positive thinker. I think it is a good way, and I believe that Indonesia is heading to a right direction now. We have a new leadership. We have young leaders. It's quite detached from the previous government. We have anti-graft commission. We call it KPK. KPK is so good for me because in the 10 years of their service, they already sent ministers, parliament members,
Judges.
governors, judges to prison. Not only judges, also in law of the president, the current president. That's reality. So, for me, if we combine the new leadership, the new spirit, the social media, I think we can have a better Indonesia. What is better Indonesia? Less corruption. Maybe we cannot eradicate everything, but at least we can make it lower. And with the social media, with the internet, I think the playing field is now flatter and flatter. We can shortcut everything through social media. We can speed up the process. So why social media is, for me, is so important? For your information, I think Indonesians are quite addicted to social media. It is not uncommon to find Indonesian, they have more than one gadget. This is the no, I have another one there, my iPhone. There's my iPhone. So I have 3. And
120% handphone penetration in Indonesia.
This is the number. Now, Indonesia is the 4th largest country on Facebook. We are 50 million strong there. And we are also the 4th largest country on Twitter, 15 million. And most of the people who are active digitally, they are young, around 18 to 30 or 40. So we are young Indonesian. We are new Indonesia, I think. And one more thing that I think can make some difference. In Indonesia, we have, we call it quite religious people, depend on how you see that. But we have 2 large Muslim organizations, moderate Muslim organizations. First, Muhammadiyah. They claim they have 30 million members. And another one, NU, or Nahdlatul Ulama. They said that they have around 60 million members. So it's more than half of the population belong to these 2 groups. So I imagine if those 2 groups join force to relaunch the anti-graft campaign they did before, but relaunch it and reissue the fatwa. What is fatwa? Fatwa is a religious term in Islam. It's how to translate? Religious decree, religious ruling, to say that corruption is forbidden, is haram. Haram is even harder than forbidden. Haram means if you do that, if you conduct that thing, you go straight to the hell. So that's haram. So why I think religious leaders can play the role? Because they still have quite an influence in Indonesia, mostly in rural area. But if they join force, we have a new leadership, we have social media, we have young people in Indonesia. I think in, I don't know in how many years, we are heading to a better nation, less corruption in Indonesia. And yeah, I think that's my point. Young people, new technology, new atmosphere, new leadership, and Muslim leaders, they can make some difference.
Okay. I guess just one question that does raise, which is you're talking about really the patronage corruption that's come with decentralisation, and you're saying that it's more democratic than what it's replacing. Are you saying by implication that you believe it should be left alone, or it could be tackled by Jokowi? And if so, how? Because I think the criticisms I've read of the Corruption Eradication Commission really are that they go after big, high-profile targets, but don't necessarily deal on a systemic level with patronage corruption.
That's right. I think that one of the things, I mean, the weakest link in tackling corruption in Indonesia is the judiciary, which is itself deeply, deeply corrupt, and is perceived to be so by Indonesians. So some more stats. Every year there's a survey of, which institutions do you think are most corrupt. This year the police topped out at 91% of respondents believing the police are corrupt, followed very closely by the DPR, the National Parliament, at 89%, and the judiciary came third at 86%. So 86% of respondents believe the court system and the judicial system is corrupt, and I just wonder what drugs the other 14% are on, and they're probably members of the judiciary. And so I think that tackling, rooting out corruption in that way will be difficult, because there's nowhere to go with your corruption. I think one thing that will happen so what I'm trying to do is draw a distinction between graft. And I think the criticism of the KPK is not fair, actually, because I think they are precisely going after people who engage in graft, in massive, in-your-face wickedness. And Indonesians don't like that, and they won't vote for people who... So a lot of bupatis, of district heads, there's more than 50% turnover of incumbents because people get too big for their boots and don't redistribute enough of the wealth that they're taking in, and they get thrown out. So I think that trying to make a distinction between the extractive corruption and the distributive corruption, and possibly, and this is something that happened in Europe 150 years ago, and in the States really not until the 1940s, is that you regularize that corruption and patronage. In the United States, political action committees, PACs, in elections are essentially massive vehicles for what under Indonesian election laws is corrupt activity. Distribution of funding to political aspirants based on particular commercial interests. In Indonesia, that's illegal. In the States, we've just legalized it. And it's the same thing with, for example, my thing of sticking money onto the back of my driving license. Actually, if there were a functional system of collecting fines and etc. That's what you have here, right? Here you get caught driving the wrong way up a one-way street, you get a fine. It just goes through conventional channels. And I think that there'll be more of that. So when in your experience of trying to get your permit for the school, of course, those permits are supposed to be free now, but there's a fee associated with them in the same way there's a fee associated for anything. And if you want it done faster, there's a bigger fee associated. Well, try getting a visa to Australia. It cost me $160 to come here, and had I wanted to have it done in 3 days' time, it would have cost me 190 or whatever.
Fast track.
That's fast track. And that's it's just formalizing payments that are at the moment extremely informal. And I think that sort of reform will get rid of quite a lot of the petty small stuff that gets up people's noses and that people complain about. I do want to say one thing about the social media, because I completely agree with you, and there's some fantastic examples, particularly in the last election, of how social media was used as a systematic way of creating a parallel monitoring system that really safeguarded an election that was looking, slightly wobbly for a bit. But there is a great digital divide in Indonesia. So it's true that Indonesia has the biggest Facebook community, that it has the biggest, massive Twitter community, and et cetera, but I stormed into the office of Telkomsel in Ambon, which is up in eastern Indonesia. I started my journey down at the bottom and went in a big anti-clockwise circle up there. And I'd been on the seas and roads for 5 months before I even saw an office of the biggest telecommunication company. And when I saw one, I stormed in there and said, "You've sold me this dud package because before I left Jakarta, got an all-data package and this and that, and it's never worked, and I've never got 3G, and I've never, this thing doesn't work. Fix my phone." And they said, "Well, it's working perfectly." And I looked at it and it was working perfectly. Well, for 4 months, I hadn't been anywhere where you could get 3G. There was no question of posting anything to Facebook or being on Twitter. You can get really low grade, communication. So at the moment, there's still quite a divide between where the big mass of the population is. So it's true that most Indonesians are part of that. But I worry sometimes that there'll be an increasing gap, and that the people who are already in the parts of the country that are most prone to the sort of patronage networks and corruption I'm talking about are the least able to do anything about it through those particular instances. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I agree with that. But for me, if we can have 1 or 2 good sample, I think people will follow suit. They think, well, if Jakarta can do that kind of war against corruption, for example, a province or a city next to Jakarta will try to have that kind of war too, and hopefully it can be, followed by others. But of course, we have some problem with that coverage of the technology. But I also interested in continuing my story before. It's not the end of the story, actually. You remember the officer that went back to my school? He's our friend now. We always invite him to come to the graduation day of our students. And I think he's quite happy to be around us to see what we are doing. So for me, we actually can change their mind, the corrupted mind, into a better mind. If we ask them, we talk to them, they change their behavior. So I always think positive. I think if we find 10 corrupted officers, maybe we can convert them, maybe 5 of them to be a better one, hopefully. And another story, a few months after that, after we got the permit, we still need a supervision from the Office of Education. Why supervision? Well, of course, to ensure the quality and everything. But sometimes it's only a regular visit without anything to do with the quality. And when another official came to our school, I didn't know the visit, but after a few weeks, the teacher talked to me. Hey, we had a visitor coming from the education office, and we collect monies, small money from teachers to give her transportation fee to go back to the office. And I said, what? I got angry with my teacher. Hey, we built a school to have a value, and this is our value. We don't want to play with that kind of game. And I told them, why you have to give money to an official? And they told us, well, that's the norm. This is like a normal day. That's what happens every day. So yes, sometimes it's part of the culture. I don't know if we define the culture as the regular thing that you have to do. And the official happily received the money. It's small money, but again, that happened.
I think it's interesting that you say that it's part of the culture, because it genuinely is part of the culture. So this morning we were talking about...
Not for me, but
no,
for...
exactly. But in many of of Indonesia's cultures, but many of Indonesia's suku and adat, there are traditions of reciprocal exchange. So we were talking this morning about sacrifice of animals. You know, there are these huge, in at least 5 of the ethnic groups that I know about, there are, particularly on someone's death, there are big funerals that involve the mass sacrifice of animals, and it's, you know, a destruction of wealth, essentially, which shows respect for the person who's died. But those sacrifices are actually part of this incredibly complex web of exchange. So, you know, my grandmother dies, I have 1 buffalo, I sacrifice that 1 buffalo, but you bring a buffalo to my grandmother's and you bring a pig to my grandmother's funeral. And I'm now beholden to you for a pig and you for a buffalo that has horns at least as big as the horns of the buffalo that you gave me. And you can call on that. There's this web of exchange and reciprocity that is deeply, deeply embedded in many of the cultures of the islands. And I think that the sort of thing that you described with your teachers, well, yeah, it's a mark of respect, and that's what's always happened, and we, you know, we collect money and we give it to them, but when we need something from them, you know, we can go and talk to our friend. I mean, you just said, you know, that guy's now our friend, and I bet you if you need something from Dinas, you know, you're like, oh, we'll just call Pa siapa, you know,
Yes.
because he's our friend now. So that sort of reciprocity is very deeply embedded culturally in many of the cultures. And of course, you know, you can't talk about Indonesian culture because it's, you know, this great, great diversity. But if we're talking about social structures, there is a culture of exchange that's deeply embedded. And I think that the culture of corrupt exchange, in a way, mirrors that quite closely in some ways. It's a fascinating piece of research done by anthropologists from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And they played these kind of reciprocity and exchange games in different cultures, because they discovered that something like, I mean, over 90% of all psychological experiments are basically done on American psych students as their samples. And so they said, well, let's take some of these things and do them in other cultures. And they did one which is about reciprocity in cultures around the world. And what they found was that, and in fact, one of them was Lembata in eastern Indonesia, which is a Lamalera, which is a whale hunting culture, where there's a lot of everyone hunts collectively and then doles out the goods. And they found that the more collectivist your culture is, and the more it's involved in elaborate exchanges, the less willing people were to receive gifts, because they were concerned that that would bring with it obligations of reciprocity, which I think is quite interesting.
Good.
Sorry, apropos of nothing.
I think we should open it up to some questions there. So does anybody in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, just place up your hand. There are people here with microphones who will come around. So maybe the lady here in the middle first, please, in the white. And there's a gentleman, sorry, excuse me, gentleman just here. We'll get the microphone to him too for next. Yep.
Thank you. Just to finish off your story, Fuadi, about the teacher coming down to check on the school, would you have expected the teacher to have had their transport paid back to Jakarta, and this was extra money on the top, or did the teacher genuinely not have transport paid back to Jakarta or where they had come from? What was the expectation of paying the money on top of their transport?
Okay, actually it's not far from the office of the education office. It's only maybe 5 kilometers. So it's like a regular visit to check, to ensure the quality. So for me, we don't need to give any money. It's their rule. Their job. They get paid by the government. But again, it's part of the daily, it's hard to say it's norm, right? But that's the way they do. And there is a catch, actually. If you don't, my teacher argued with me, if we didn't give any tips, it's like a tips actually, it's not really big money, she will hold the information that we need for our school. For example, more training for teachers, new books for students. It's not easy to get that information from the office because we didn't give any tips. And I don't know whether I answer your question, but
No,
that's
you did. No, I understand that.
yeah.
Now. Thank you.
But for me, I don't want to follow that game again, and sometimes it's not easy to convince the teachers that we have to do we don't have to do that because they've been teacher for years and that they've been doing forever. So it's like an education to educate people how to see the system now. We are changing. We don't follow the old game. We create our new game.
But the risk is that you may not get the information that
That's
you
the
want.
risk.
It's difficult to buck the system.
Yeah, that's a risk. Yeah.
Thank you.
Gentleman here.
Yes, the current Independent Commission Against Corruption in New South Wales has revealed massive corruption in both the Liberal and Labor parties, the two major political parties. My question to you would be, isn't the culture of corruption just a product of democracy, whether it's in Indonesia, Australia or America?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I've lived in a number of autocracies and found them no less corrupt than democracies. But I do agree with you, and I think there's a long discussion to be had about democracy and the way. Democracy is essentially about the exchange of favors for votes, isn't it really? Except that what we believe that what we do is we collectively bargain around what those favors will be through the process of developing party manifestos and etc. There's a public discussion around what those favors will be in terms of the programs, etc. And then, and this is what makes it not corrupt, theoretically, those favors are then delivered, those programs are delivered equally to everyone, regardless of whether or not you voted for that party, right? And what's different in democracies or in systems that we call corrupt is that the favors are delivered much more specifically to the individuals or to the industries that specifically support political campaigns. But I agree that democracy, I think, democracy is inherently a system of exchange. Now, the question is, how do you make that exchange as rata, as evenly distributed as possible? That's what we're trying to guard against with the anti-corruption commissions, for example. I'd say.
I read an interesting article on the internet about that. Yeah, corruption can be found anywhere actually, and I think I quote something from Samuel Huntington that he said that corruption is part of the game. Is a lubricant, it's a grease to the machine of democracy. If you want to speed up the development of a nation, sometimes you need corruption to speed up the process. If you follow the rules, sometimes you have to wait. But if you want to move faster, so you have to do shortcut. And to do the shortcut, sometimes you have to offer something. That's what I learned from the article, and I think partly right, maybe.
And,
Can I just
and
ask a question? Sorry, is it actually true to say that the political process fuels the corruption because of the cost of funding the campaigns needs to be, recovered by the political parties?
That's definitely true. There's virtually no public funding for the political parties in Indonesia, and actually that's a great weakness of the system because it means that each party is essentially trying to make the electoral machine work, deliver to party coffers. And Indonesia has developed this to extraordinary heights of sophistication, the way of getting money into political parties. So one is that in all of these 500 different districts, in which there are not just direct elections for the head of the district and the vice head of the district, but also parliaments. There are separate parliaments in each of those 500. Oh, and then in the 35 provinces and etc. Each of those people who want to stand as candidate for those very lucrative positions pay money to political parties to be allowed to be their nominee, for example. It starts there. The current estimates of how much it costs to become a candidate and run a campaign for district head are on the order of about $2.5 million, which may not seem much in the context of certainly not in the context of a US campaign, but this is being reproduced by on average 10 candidates, for on average 500 districts, and plus all of the parliamentary seats. So there's an enormous cost coming out of the system. And don't forget, only one of them is going to win. And then the other 9 still have to pay back their debts, but don't have the machinery to do that because a win gives you the machinery to pay back your debts with contracts, with patronage jobs, whatever. And in fact, Indonesia has the lowest rate of election-related violence in Asia, but the highest rate of election-related suicide in the world.
Really?
Because of that.
So there's a gentleman here in the middle. You have a question.
Elizabeth?
Yes.
Well, I'm afraid you are part of the problem when you say the small money is not the same as graft. Corruption is corruption. Anywhere you look at it, it's very inconvenient when you go through the actual process of paying the fine. We experience it in Malaysia. Malaysia is the same as Indonesia. We had a very small problem. Had I given the officer 5 ringgit, we would have gone through the border, but instead we chose house arrest, and we were detained for a whole day. The trouble with white people going to these Asian countries, paying this small money, it makes it legitimate for the local officials, and they say, oh, it's okay. All these white people come here, they pay, they give us money to get out of their problem. So it becomes a practice. And then in the end, it becomes a problem for the locals because these policemen, officials look for opportunities to get money from anyone who goes up to a counter and wants a quick service. They want to see your money first.
I completely agree that people who clip money to the back of their driving licenses are part of the problem, and I completely agree that I'm one of them. I find it very difficult to leap from that to saying that this was a problem created by white people. I mean, in general, I'm no more or less likely to be subject to that than any other person in Indonesia, and I don't think that there's anything magical about a white person doing it that legitimizes it any more than your teachers doing it or anything else. I'm not seeing that leap myself, but I do completely agree with you that people who engage in this petty corruption legitimize is a strong word, but I agree that we definitely sustain that habit and that norm. Yes, I completely agree with you.
Good. Well, thank you. I've actually just been given the little notice that we need to wrap it up. So if you could please thank our speakers for today. Thank you very much.